Let's crack on, shall we? The book of the Apocalypse. You'll notice I'm wearing my glasses this time. That's because I've notes. Because I've got content. This talk, unlike the previous one, has content. So strap in. Some things to think about the book of the Apocalypse. Some key features of the book. Firstly, obviously, it is revelational. The book of the Apocalypse claims to present, as all apocalyptic literature does, hidden or invisible realities, which are, in some sense, and this is something I want us to talk about this afternoon, in some sense already true, but in some other senses yet to come. And as is typical in apocalyptic literature, these invisible realities are made known by a prophet who is especially privileged. There's a lot of emphasis on the senses. Interestingly, both vision and hearing as an interesting combination. Sometimes the emphasis is more on what he sees, other times the emphasis is more on what he hears, but we need to hold the two together in order to make sense of the whole thing. But at the same time, more unusually for apocalyptic literature, the book is very self-consciously a book, or a scroll, of course. It's very self-consciously written, and the scroll is an important artifact. The audience of this is clearly envisaged as a reader, and there's a consciousness that what the seer has seen and heard is being distilled through the medium of writing. And the effect that this has is to create a certain distance between the audience on the one hand and the experience of the prophet on the other. So in some ways it's less vivid because of this than some other apocalyptic literature where we don't have quite the same degree of self-conscious authorship as we do here. The book of the Apocalypse shares with many other such texts a set of symbols. A number of these symbols are numbers, in fact. Numbers are very important, as we'll see later on in the Apocalypse. The most important numbers, anybody? 12 and? 607. 12 and 7, right? I don't know if you ever noticed 12 is 3 times 4 and 7 is 3 plus 4. That's not a coincidence. So amongst other things, we have 7 lampstands, 7 stars, 7 angels, 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 horns, 7 eyes of the Lamb, 7 trumpets, 7 peals of thunder, 7 heads of the dragon and the beast, 7 bowls, 7 plagues, and 7 kings. Are these, some or all of these, all the same things, just represented differently? Is a plague the same thing as a bowl? Is a head of the dragon the same thing as a horn? I don't know, you tell me. 4s, we also have 4s. There are 4 living creatures, 4 horsemen, very famously, and 4 angels, 1 on each corner of the earth. And yes, just as they knew that the earth wasn't flat, they did also know that it didn't have corners. 12 gates, 12 foundation stones, 12 fruits of the tree, 12 stars on the crown, 24 elders, and 144,000 elect. Very often these numbers are not about counting things. I know that Jehovah's Witnesses worry terribly about the fact that there are only 144,000 people. Actually, immediately afterwards, the author says a number that no one could count. And 144,000 isn't a number that no one can count. It's just one more than 139,999. So it's quite easy to count, really. Again, numbers might not be about counting, but might be symbols. 7, the number of perfection. 12 is also a number of perfection. But 12 is also significant for Jews, number of tribes of Israel. For Christians, not coincidentally, number of apostles. Animals, very important in the book of the Apocalypse. 4 living creatures, 1 lamb, 4 horses, 1 eagle, loads of locusts, 1 white horse, 1 red dragon, and at least 3 beasts, depending on how you count. Again, how many of these things are really the same thing, envisaged differently. Now, I think one of the most interesting features of the Apocalypse, when you compare it to other apocalyptic literature, is that it is much less coherent. It doesn't hang together nearly as well as a lot of other apocalyptic literature. It's particularly difficult to picture, to envisage one thing leading into another. It is very, very dreamlike. You know how in dreams it all seems to make perfect sense until you try to explain it. And then you think, well, how can that have been? It doesn't make any sense. It seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. The Apocalypse is really like that. And it has the accumulative effect of creating a sense of mystery, that sense of transcendence, that sense that language and reality really are being stretched to breaking point by the incommunicability of the heavenly reality. I just realized what a pretentious word incommunicability is, but you know what I mean. And yet, despite all of this confusion and complication, the basic message of the Apocalypse seems to be perfectly straightforward. That is, God is in charge, and he knows what he's doing. He's in charge of the world, and he's in charge of history. And if, for reasons of his own, he is for a moment allowing his people to suffer, he will intervene decisively on behalf of the oppressed. He will bring history to its preordained goal. That preordained goal is much more explicitly than in Old Testament apocalyptic, the perfect communion of God and man. That's where we're all going. We're all going to dwell in the city of God, where the Lamb is the temple and the Son. That's where we're all going. The purpose of writing this book, then, is to reassure everything's going to be fine because God knows what he's doing, and therefore to call for endurance. In this regard, the Apocalypse is very like much of the New Testament. Many of St. Paul's letters have, in fact, the same basic message. Endure, it's all going to be fine. This call for endurance means obedience and faithfulness in a time of crisis. As I say, not radically different from the message of St. Paul and indeed the Catholic epistles. And very often in Jewish apocalyptic, when it is eschatological, the message is substantially the same. Keep going, it's all going to be fine, endure, keep the faith. But there are four ways in which the Apocalypse is especially new, I think. Obviously, the main thing is it's Christian. So Jesus is important. The revelation is both a prophetic vision of Jesus and a prophetic vision from Jesus. He gives the seer a vision of himself. The figure of the risen Christ, risen from the dead, the Lamb though slain that lives forever, is at the center of the vision. Now, this relates to an important shift that necessarily takes place in Christianity. The shift from eschatological visions always being about the future, which you think, well, of course they are. That's what eschatology means, right? But as I've already alluded to, for Christians, there is a sense in which the end of the world has happened. It happened 2,000 years ago when Christ died and was raised from the dead. And we now live in the end times. Those of you who have intellectual and or pretentious preachers as your parish clergy will very possibly have heard the phrase eschatological tension or realized eschatology, this tension between the already and the not yet. Now that tension in which we in some ways expect the future still and yet in other ways think that the future's already started is expressed in the way in which the book of the Apocalypse is different. Because what we end up with is a temporal, here's more pretentious language, temporal ambivalence. Right? Good name for a band, but also it means, when is this supposed to be? Is it now? Is it the past? Or is it the future? And the book of the Apocalypse deliberately does not tell you a straight answer to that. It captures eschatological tension through temporal ambivalence. The future victory of God's people in heaven has already been realized. The hope of the saints is not just in the future promises of God, but in a victory that has already been won by Christ through his resurrection. And so, as in St. Paul and other parts of the New Testament, this eschatological tension transforms the symbolic and language world with which this literature engages. Okay, so point one, why is it different? Because it's Christian. And therefore, eschatological tension, temporal ambivalence. Point two, artistry. Now, on the one hand, as I've already said, the visions are very hard to imagine. They don't make sense. It's not coherent. But on the other hand, it is much more clearly well structured than most of the apocalyptic literature that we can read in Volume 1 of Ounsworth. You can see that somebody has sat down and figured out how to structure this, how to lay it out. If you go on the interweb, you will find lots of suggestions for the structure of the book of Revelation. Google that phrase. You'll find all sorts of different suggestions from different scholars. I'm not going to bore you with them all, but the fact of the matter is there is clearly an attempt to present a structure. There is a sense of careful composition, even though, interestingly, the author of Hebrews, of the Apocalypse, I beg your pardon, whether deliberately or not, is writing in absolutely terrible Greek. I mean, it's really, really ropey. Now, most of the New Testament is in slightly ropey Greek because the Greek of the New Testament, it was kind of the lingua franca of the time. It's the language that you used if you wanted people to understand what you were writing. Like these days, you'd use English if you wanted to have a successful YouTube channel, right? There's no point doing it in Croatian. Nobody outside Croatia is going to watch. But if you do it in English, Croatians will watch and so will Swedes, right? In the olden days, 2,000 years ago, that was Greek. So it was very often people's second language. And you can tell when you read a lot of the New Testament, it's in somebody's second language. Exceptions, Hebrews, Luke. Good stuff. The Apocalypse, I mean, you'd think it was somebody's like fourth or fifth language. It's really bad. And a classic example of that is the title of the subtitle of this talk, or the title, I can't remember, The Being, the Was, and the Coming. That is a direct quotation from the Apocalypse. Jesus Christ is the being, the was, and the coming. Now, actually, it's not as bad as that, because the being is a perfectly good way in Greek to say the one who is. And the coming is a perfectly good way in Greek of saying the one who is coming. But the was is as bad Greek as it is English. You cannot describe anybody as the was. It's just nonsense. And yet there's this artistry alongside this terrible Greek. That's kind of interesting. The book of the Apocalypse is more interested than any other apocalyptic literature, with the arguable exception of Jubilees, more interested in what we might call the heavenly court. What heaven looks like. And what heaven looks like is definitely a throne room, which is also a court. Its occupants and its furnishings. We're really interested in what it looks like, what goes on there, who's moving about and where they move about, and all that kind of thing. It shares with Jubilees a strong interest in the heavenly liturgy. And again, that sense, like Jubilees, that there is some kind of connection between the liturgy that we're being invited to witness in heaven and the liturgy that goes on down here on earth, except that now that liturgy isn't the sacrificial liturgy in the temple, but the sacrificial liturgy of the Eucharist in Christianity. The action in Hebrews, I always talk about Hebrews, it keeps coming out of my mouth. The action in the Apocalypse is interspersed with hymns, right, which are very obviously they're liturgical, and those hymns function a bit like, do you know about the chorus in Greek plays? Yeah, you have all these people off to one side, typically 12, interestingly, who would sort of sing a little song that commented on the action. And so it's like a little break and now the chorus. And the chorus would tell you what's going on. And these hymns, whoever they're sung by in the Apocalypse, do the same thing. So third difference, particular interest in heaven as a place of liturgy. Fourth difference, and this in some ways is the most striking, it's not pseudonymous. That is to say, it is not anonymous, and a lot of apocalyptic literature is anonymous, but neither is it purporting to be written by somebody who very obviously didn't write it, right? Like, for example, the similitudes of Enoch. You know who Enoch is? Noah's grandfather, right? The similitudes of Enoch was written in Greek. Noah's grandfather did not have Greek, because Greek had not been invented. So, and nobody thinks for a minute that the similitudes of Enoch was really written by Enoch. Nobody thinks for a minute that the Testament of Levi was really written by Levi, and so on. But we are clearly supposed to think that the book of the Apocalypse was written by John. So it is not overtly pseudepigraphal. Now, you know the word pseudepigraphal, right? Yeah, of course you do. It means given a false name, right? Ascribe a false ascription. You know it now. There you are. You're welcome. What was I going to say? Oh, yes. So there is another question, which is, did St. John, in fact, write it? Should I come to that now? Why not? That's a kind of interesting question, isn't it? If I can find my notes on whether St. John, in fact, wrote it, because I definitely have some somewhere. But I think, I'm just going to look for those, because I do want to talk about it. Here's the problem. On the one hand, it's quite difficult to explain the Greek of the Apocalypse as being by the same person as the author of the Gospel and the Epistles. Because the Gospel and the Epistles, second language Greek, yes, but it's perfectly decent. It's perfectly readable. It's a little bit Janet and John, but it's perfectly readable. Whereas Apocalypse, totally awful. Some people think that the Greek of the Apocalypse sounds like somebody whose first language was a Semitic language. That is to say, probably Aramaic. And it's kind of like they've learnt Greek badly, and they're sometimes saying literally in Greek what you would say perfectly reasonably in Aramaic. Now, of course, all of this could be for effect. And there are these interesting theories about where you might have deliberate mistakes in the Greek to draw attention to particular points. Always difficult to prove. Statistically, the analysis of the vocabulary in the Apocalypse means that some people doubt it's related to anything else by John. We've got a lot of words not in the Apocalypse that John really likes, such as truth, darkness, eternal, believe. And then we've got a whole load of stuff in the Apocalypse, obviously, that we don't have in the Gospels or the Epistles. But that might just be because it's a different genre. On the other hand, there are some very strong parallels with St. John's Gospel that mean it cannot be a coincidence. Just examples of this, the Lamb, right? John the Baptist saying, "Behold the Lamb of God." In the book of the Apocalypse, Jesus is the Lamb. Although, interestingly, it uses a different word for lamb. It's two Greek words for lamb. I don't know why. We have being washed in blood, which might relate to the blood flowing from Jesus' side. We have the idea of a faithful witness, which is a big thing, both in the Gospel and the Epistles. The word, I am, the beginning and the end. The importance of the word amen. Remember, Jesus likes to say, "Amen, amen, I say to you." The concept of passing on authority from the Father to the Son. Central metaphors, water, light, life. Going up, coming down. You get a lot of that in the Gospel and also in the Apocalypse. And there are some interesting parallels between the criticisms that St. John levels against whoever it is that he doesn't like in his first epistle, and the criticisms made against people in the 7 churches at the beginning of the Apocalypse, you have these letters to the 7 churches, and he's telling them off about stuff, mostly. And the telling off has very clear parallels with the telling off that some people over there get in the first epistle of St. John. We have false Jews, deceivers, antichrists, Satan. Both communities, the good guys, are addressed as witnesses and conquerors. So it seems to me either the author of the Apocalypse is very familiar with the other Johannine writings, or the author of the other Johannine writings is very familiar with the Apocalypse, or they're all coming from some kind of similar milieu, if I may, in which people use the same kind of ideas and express them in very similar ways. It feels like all of this stuff emerges from, if not a distinctive Christian community, at least a distinctive mode of Christian expression. So that's kind of interesting. Now, one suggestion which I quite like is that the Gospel and the Epistles are in fact not themselves written by John the Apostle, the beloved disciple, but by John the Elder, who came along a bit later on. I could talk about this for hours, but you would be so bored. But basically, there's this theory that John, the Gospel, and the Epistles were written by John the Elder, who's mentioned in some early Christian writings, and who basically took the testimony of John the Apostle and kind of put it into decent Greek and laid it out nicely and told the story in a clear and coherent way. But that John the Apostle himself, Jewish fisherman, ropey Greek, maybe he wrote the Apocalypse himself and didn't have the elder to tidy it up for him. It's just a possibility. I don't insist upon it. But the beloved disciple, if the beloved disciple is the son of Zebedee and brother of James, they're both Christian leaders from Palestine, he and the beloved disciple. They both end up in Ephesus. They both have widely acknowledged authority, but face some dissent. The only difficulty about this theory, really, is that the author of the Apocalypse doesn't speak of himself as an apostle. The word apostle does occur, so it's not like he doesn't know the word, but he always refers to himself as the prophet. So why should this be? Is he being unduly modest? Surely apostles outrank prophets, right? They outrank everybody, except the Pope, obviously, and Our Lady. But it seems kind of weird. But on the other hand, it might be the nature of the literature is such that what matters is that the author is a prophet. Otherwise, he doesn't have the necessary credentials to say what he wants to say. We do have, of course, the 12 foundation stones, don't we? Do you know, in the book of the Apocalypse, 12 foundations of the city. On the 12 foundation stones are written the names of the apostles of the Lamb. Is it odd for one of the apostles of the Lamb to say, well, there's 12 foundation stones and on them are the names of the apostles of the Lamb, without making any reference to the fact that one of those names is his? I don't know. You decide. Now, as you know, the book of the Apocalypse purports at least to have been written in Patmos. What is he doing in Patmos? Whoever this guy is, let's call him John. What is he doing in Patmos? Patmos does make sense as the origin of the book, or at least of the 7 letters with which the book begins. If you look at a map, you'll see Patmos is a little island off the western coast of Turkey, Asian Turkey. And all of the 7 churches are in that part of Turkey. And they're kind of more or less in the order that you would visit them if you're going from Patmos and heading east. So that's kind of interesting. We are told that the author is on Patmos because of preaching the gospel. Now, what does that mean? It could mean 2 things. One, he went there to preach the gospel. That makes sense. But why on earth would you go to Patmos? No one lives there. It's basically just a little military base. Or Is he on Patmos as a punishment for having been preaching the gospel? This might be true. Being exiled, especially to a largely deserted island, was a fairly common Roman punishment. But it was only a common Roman punishment for posh people, right? Like the daughters of emperors very often found themselves banished to an island because they'd been having sex with the wrong men, or women in some cases. But John the Apostle, I mean, you and I know he's important, but it seems extremely unlikely that the Roman Empire thought he was somebody important enough that they would put him into exile as opposed to, cutting his head off or crucifying him. Patmos belonged to the city of Miletus. It was a fortress island, military garrison, though it did have quite a famous temple of Artemis. Now, the reason that he's writing, why ever he's writing from Patmos, we don't know. There are explicit references to persecution. So this maybe helps us to understand not only why he's writing it, but maybe also when he's writing it, which some people are interested in. We've already seen the fundamental message is endure, persevere, keep the faith. It makes particular sense to give that message at a time when people might be tempted to not endure, which would be, for example, because people are giving you a hard time, right? You're getting persecuted one way or the other. Now, the mainstream view for many years in biblical studies, in fact, going all the way back to St. Irenaeus of Lyon, who is very mainstream, the mainstream view was that this means it must have been written in the time of the Emperor Domitian. The Emperor Domitian, we are talking about coming towards the end of the 1st century. Domitian was the son of Vespasian, who became emperor in the year 70. But I think Domitian became emperor around about 90. Am I right? Anybody? You can look it up. About then. And he did persecute Christians. So, right, that all kind of makes sense. There's no particular problem with the book of the Apocalypse being written round about then. Tertullian, in his Apology, tells us explicitly that Domitian was the first to do a kind of systematic persecution of Christians, though he also tells us that later on he repented of it because he realized that the Christians had been slandered. But this idea of persecution, and in particular Roman persecution, marries nicely with a lot of the imagery in the book of the Apocalypse around the worship of the beast and its image. Because, of course, outside Rome, the Roman Empire encouraged worship of the emperor and of Rome, kind of personification of Rome, the goddess Roma. And the emperor cult, as we call it, was very, very much part of the way in which the Romans attempted to impose their cultural and political authority over people. And this is being represented in the book of the Apocalypse as the worship of the beast and its image. There is this stuff, about receiving the mark of the beast. We also, of course, very famously have Babylon, the great whore. So Babylon, there's this woman who's a whore. That's the word it uses. Apologies if it's offensive. But Babylon, as well as being this lady of negotiable virtue, is also a city, right? And the question is, which city? And generally speaking, it is thought that that city is in fact Rome, thinly disguised. There is also a theory that it is Jerusalem, and it's by no means impossible that it is both. Babylon is kind of the archetypal evil city that oppresses people. So you might say, well, why Jerusalem then? Is it possible that the author is inviting us to see that Jerusalem, which of course slew Christ, albeit in the person of its Roman governor, but certainly with the connivance of the priestly authorities, Jerusalem, which should be the holy city, has instead become Babylon, firstly in its murdering of Jesus, and then secondly in its ongoing persecution of Christians, which of course we see with Saul, and presumably when Saul stopped Sauling and started Pauling, that wasn't the end of persecution. Somebody else would have just taken over, because, that's what you do, isn't it? Where am I? Yes, I am there. Suetonius, the Roman historian, tells us that Domitian allowed himself to be called our Lord and God. And that expression is insistently applied in the book of the Apocalypse to the one who sits upon the throne. So it might be seen as deliberately taking a title that Domitian liked for himself and saying, "Nah, that doesn't apply to you, it only applies to, actual God." In the time of Domitian, the city of Ephesus, which is one of the 7 cities written to, and is right across the water from Patmos, received a new emperor cult temple during Domitian's reign. Also, Suetonius tells us that Domitian extended, I'm going to have to explain this, aren't I? You don't know, I suppose, about the Fiscus Judaicus? No? Oh dear. What do they teach in schools these days? So, in the time of Jesus, you remember there's that bit when they ask him about paying the temple tax, right? And he says, well, actually, I don't have to, but go and get the fish, and it's got 2 coins, and that's for me and you, right? Jews were very proud of the fact that they all paid the temple tax. It connected them to the temple. In the year 70, the Romans destroyed the temple, right? No more tax. Hooray, at least we don't have to pay that anymore. Nuh-uh. The Romans said, you're all going to carry on paying the tax, but now we're having it, and we're going to give it to the temple of Jupiter in Rome, which of course the Jews would have hated, but there it is. They were made to pay it. And it was called the Fiscus Judaicus, the Jewish tax. Now, some Jews, at least it is alleged, would pretend not to be Jewish so as not to have to pay the Jewish tax. Makes sense, doesn't it? But Domitian clamped down on this, and he basically kind of had, well, let's call it an inquisition, in which he went out looking for Jews who were pretending to be Gentiles to make them pay the tax. And this may well have become an occasion for state persecution. And you can imagine somebody who's a Christian, but had been a Jew, saying, no, I'm not Jewish, I'm Christian. And Domitian and his minions saying, I'm afraid that still counts as Jewish, hand over the money. So that could lead to the persecution in particular of Jewish Christians. So this is a possibility. On the other hand, Nero. You know about 666. This is one thing that everybody reads about on the internet, don't you? 666 is, in a certain way of counting, the word Nero. Although actually you can get loads of other words that add up to 666. But one thing which is very interesting is this. A lot of very early manuscripts of the book of the Apocalypse don't say 666. They say 616. And the value of the letter N is 50. Okay? Now, the Latin for Nero is Nero. The Greek for Nero is Neron. So depending on how you spell it, it would either add up to 666 or 616. So it might be, that's a kind of hint, that maybe Nero is the guy we should be looking at. Certainly, the author of the Apocalypse expects us to get who he's talking about. In the time, the latter part of the 1st century, after the death of Nero in the year, was it 69 or 70 he died? 69, I think. Nero died by his own hand. Qualis artifex pereo, he said. What an artist I die. He was pretentious. Anyway, stabbed himself, dead. Or was he? Because a lot of people in the eastern part of the empire, so Greece, Turkey, that way, they thought Nero was marvelous. Because all the persecuting that Nero did, he did in Rome. All the giving people a hard time and making people's lives miserable in Rome. What he did in a lot of cities in the eastern part of the empire was let them off their taxes. So they thought he was marvelous. And also he kind of pandered to their artistic sensibilities. So they liked Nero. And the rumor grew that Nero wasn't really dead. Or that, yes, he did die, but hooray, he's been brought back to life and he's somewhere out east and he's going to come back and everything's going to be marvellous. This is known as the myth of Nero redivivus, the revived Nero. Now, all of this stuff about the beast that looked as though it was killed, right, but actually wasn't, that you find in the Book of the Apocalypse, that could be a reference to the fact that Nero is in fact still alive. Obviously, for the author of the Apocalypse, that is not good news. It is bad news, because Nero did persecute Christians. Not very much. I mean, the Christians he persecuted them really a lot by covering them in tar and setting them on fire. And it's difficult really to be persecuted any worse than that. But he only did it to like a couple of hundred, right? Whereas Domitian and then others, we're talking about mass persecutions. This is a little teeny-weeny hideous persecution that Nero did. But on the other hand, all of this stuff might be irrelevant anyway, because increasingly we're starting to realize, I seem to have given up on my notes, never mind. We're starting to realize that persecution need not necessarily be state persecution unto death, right? Not just in the Book of the Apocalypse, but in the letter to the Hebrews and a lot of the Catholic epistles and St. Paul, there's talk about persecution, which is clearly what you might call low-level persecution. That is to say, we're not taking you and throwing you to the lions or stoning you to death, but we might be maybe staving in your windows, or we might be boycotting your shop, or we might be throwing vegetables at you in the street, or we might be spurning you at the synagogue. It's that kind of thing, that low-level persecution of people being mean to people, right? Which, people experience all over the world in all sorts of ways when people are racist or whatever, right? And you get that kind of low-level persecution. It's no fun at all, but nobody's actually trying to kill you or put you in prison. But this also requires perseverance. This also brings with it huge pressures on people to conform, and especially to conform to the state.